Before the sun crests the Judean hills, a man has already been condemned to die. He has not slept. He was arrested in a garden sometime after midnight. He has been interrogated, beaten, mocked, and handed between authorities who each found themselves caught in the same impossible knot, a man they could not simply ignore, and could not safely protect. His name, in his own Aramaic tongue, was Yeshua bar Yosef. The Greeks would call him Isis. The Romans, Jesus. History would know him simply as Jesus of Nazareth. He was approximately 30 to 35 years of age. He came from the Galilee, a region the Roman administration considered provincial, unruly, and politically volatile. He had spent roughly 1 to 3 years as an itinerant teacher and healer, gathering a following that had caught the attention of both the Jewish temple authorities in Jerusalem and the Roman prefect in the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima. This morning, Friday, the 14th or 15th of the Jewish month of Nisan, in a year historians place between 30 and 33 AD, that attention would become lethal. What happened on that day, on that hill just outside the walls of Jerusalem, was intended to be ordinary. Crucifixion was a common Roman method of execution, reserved specifically for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. Its purpose was not merely to kill. It was to humiliate, to warn, to make of the dying body a public display of imperial power. The Roman Empire had crucified thousands. They expected this one to be forgotten. They were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of a single execution in a single occupied province of the Roman Empire, and how it became the most consequential death in recorded human history. Not because of what the man's followers believed happened afterward, but because of what it set in motion. To understand what happened in Jerusalem, you must first understand Rome. By the early 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was the largest political entity the Western world had ever seen. It stretched from the Atlantic coast of modern-day Spain and Portugal to the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq, an empire of roughly 50 to 60 million people governed by a single political authority headquartered in Rome. The emperor at the time of Jesus' death was Tiberius Caesar Augustus, who had ascended to the throne in 14 AD following the death of the empire's first emperor, Augustus. Tiberius was a competent but deeply suspicious ruler, increasingly paranoid in his later years. By the time of the crucifixion, he had largely withdrawn from Rome to the island of Capri, leaving the day-to-day management of the empire to his prefects and governors. Rome's formula for managing conquered territories was deceptively simple: allow subject peoples to maintain their local customs, religions, and administrative structures, provided they paid their taxes, maintained public order, and acknowledged the ultimate authority of Rome. In practice, this meant that local elites, priests, nobles, merchant classes, were co-opted into the imperial system. They became Rome's proxies, responsible for keeping the peace in exchange for Roman support of their own power. This arrangement had a structural flaw. It depended on local elites maintaining control of their own populations. When popular movements arose that those elites could not manage, they turned to Rome for enforcement. And Rome's enforcement was brutally direct. Judea was one of the most volatile corners of this empire. Judea had been formally incorporated as a Roman province in 6 AD, following the deposition of the Herodian client King Archelaus, whom Rome found too incompetent to even serve as their proxy. The province was placed under the direct administration of a Roman prefect, a position equivalent to a military governor with judicial authority, based at the coastal city of Caesarea Maritima. The province was, from Rome's perspective, deeply problematic. The Jewish population of Judea was unique among Rome's subject peoples in several critical ways. Their monotheistic religion was exclusive and non-negotiable. Unlike most ancient religions, Judaism could not simply absorb Roman gods or participate in the imperial cult. Jewish law governed daily life in ways that extended far beyond what Rome considered the domain of religion, into commerce, diet, social relations, calendars, and politics. And within first-century Judaism itself, there was profound internal tension. The Jewish world of this period was not a unified faith community. It was a contentious, fractured landscape of competing sects, ideologies, and political visions, all of them shaped by 2 centuries of foreign domination. The Pharisees were the dominant popular movement, scholars and teachers who emphasized the interpretation and expansion of Jewish law, and whose influence extended into every Jewish community. They disagreed with each other frequently and vigorously, but their authority rested on the people, not the temple. The Sadducees were the priestly aristocracy, guardians of the temple in Jerusalem, the institution that served as the economic, religious, and political heart of Judean life. The temple's revenue from pilgrimage, sacrifices, and the annual temple tax made it one of the wealthiest institutions in the ancient Near East. The Sadducees, as temple authorities, were also Rome's primary collaborators. Their political survival depended on maintaining Roman favor. The Essenes were a separatist ascetic movement, some of whom had withdrawn to desert communities near the Dead Sea, the same region where the Dead Sea Scrolls would be discovered in 1947, giving us remarkable insight into the apocalyptic religious thinking of first-century Judaism. The Zealots and related movements, sometimes called the Fourth Philosophy by the Jewish historian Josephus, rejected Roman rule entirely and advocated armed resistance. They would eventually trigger the catastrophic Jewish-Roman Wars of 66 to 73 AD and 132 to 135 AD. And scattered throughout this landscape were numerous independent prophets, teachers, and healers, individuals who gathered followings by speaking to the profound hunger among the Jewish population for liberation, restoration, and divine intervention. Some claimed messianic authority. Most were ignored or suppressed. A few ended their lives on Roman crosses. Jesus of Nazareth emerged from this world. The economic condition of Judea in the 1st century was one of serious structural inequality. The province bore multiple layers of taxation, Roman imperial taxes, which were collected by either Roman agents or local tax farmers, the despised publicani, known in the Gospels as tax collectors, and the temple tithe and annual half-shekel temple tax, which was mandatory for all Jewish men. Studies by modern scholars including John Dominic Crossan, E.P. Sanders, and others working with Roman economic data suggest that total tax burdens in Roman Judea may have consumed somewhere between 25 and 40% of agricultural output. For subsistence farmers in the Galilee, the majority of the population, this was a devastating burden, frequently leading to debt, loss of land, and the creation of a large class of landless day laborers and dependent peasants. The sociologist and New Testament scholar Richard Horsley has argued persuasively that the teachings of Jesus must be understood against this backdrop of peasant economic distress. Sayings such as the petition for the forgiveness of debts, the term used in the Lord's Prayer in Matthew's Gospel, carried concrete economic weight in a society where debt was a constant existential threat to rural families. The temple establishment, meanwhile, was phenomenally wealthy. Josephus, writing later in the 1st century in his work, Jewish Antiquities, describes the temple treasury as holding enormous reserves of gold and silver. The annual pilgrimage festivals, above all Passover, brought hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Jerusalem, each spending money on lodging, food, and the animals required for temple sacrifice. The money changers in the temple courts, whom Jesus would famously overturn, provided the service of converting foreign coins into the temple currency required for sacrifices and the temple tax, charging a commission for the service. This economic system created a temple aristocracy with a strong vested interest in the status quo, including the maintenance of good relations with Rome. It also created a large population of economically marginalized people who were deeply receptive to voices that challenged the existing order. Let us be precise about what historians can establish, independent of theological claims. The existence of Jesus as a historical figure is not seriously disputed among mainstream scholars. Multiple independent sources from the 1st and early 2nd centuries mention him. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD in his work Annals, refers explicitly to Christus, from whom the name had its origin, who suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. This is perhaps the most significant non-Christian, non-Jewish ancient source confirming the crucifixion. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, provides two relevant passages. The more elaborate of the two, found in Antiquities of the Jews Book 18, is known as the Testimonium Flavianum. In its current form it reads, "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared." Most historians consider this passage to contain Christian interpolations added by later scribes. The claims that Jesus was the Messiah and that he appeared resurrected are inconsistent with Josephus's Jewish perspective. However, the scholarly consensus holds that an original, shorter passage about Jesus underlies the present text. The second Josephan reference, in Antiquities 20.9.1, refers to the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James. This passage is generally considered authentic. There is also evidence from the Roman governor Pliny the Younger, writing around 112 AD to Emperor Trajan about Christians in the province of Bithynia, describing their practice of singing hymns to Christ as to a god, a passage that confirms the rapid spread of the movement within 80 years of the crucifixion. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, a small village in the Galilee, a region with a complex demographic and political history. The Galilee had only been incorporated into the Hasmonean Jewish kingdom in the 2nd century BC, meaning its Jewish population was of more recent origin than that of Judea. By the 1st century, the Galilee was a prosperous agricultural region but one increasingly stressed by Roman taxation and the growth of Herodian urban centers. The city of Sepphoris, a major Roman-style urban center rebuilt by Herod Antipas, was located just 4 miles from Nazareth. Jesus' father Joseph was described in the Gospels as a tekton, a Greek word often translated carpenter, but more accurately meaning an artisan or construction worker. The proximity of a major building project in Sepphoris to the family home in Nazareth has led some historians, including John Meyer in his exhaustive multi-volume work A Marginal Jew, to speculate that Joseph and perhaps Jesus himself may have worked on Herodian construction projects. The Galilee was also a region with a strong tradition of popular prophets and social banditry, what the scholar Josephus calls brigands, but whom modern sociologists would recognize as forms of social protest against an unjust economic system. The tradition of Galilean resistance to outside authority was real and well documented. The public ministry of Jesus, the period between his emergence as a public figure and his execution, lasted somewhere between 1 and 3 years. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, suggest a ministry of approximately 1 year. The Gospel of John implies 3 years by mentioning 3 different Passovers. The scholarly reconstruction of the historical Jesus, pursued by the quest for the historical Jesus movement beginning in the 18th century and continuing vigorously today, has produced significant consensus on certain core features of his public activity, even as it has generated enormous debate on others. What most historians agree on, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, a widely acknowledged historical figure whose execution by Herod Antipas is mentioned independently by Josephus. Jesus operated primarily in the Galilee, with Capernaum as his apparent base. He gathered a core group of disciples, whom the tradition numbers at 12, and a wider circle of followers. He taught in synagogues and open spaces. He was known as an exorcist and healer, activities which, in the 1st century framework, were understood as signs of divine power and were deeply integrated into his public profile. He maintained table fellowship with those considered socially marginal, tax collectors, sinners, the unclean, in a manner that was politically and religiously provocative. And he made his final journey to Jerusalem during the Passover pilgrimage season, where he died by crucifixion. The content of his teaching, the kingdom of God, the reversal of social hierarchies, the forgiveness of sins, the imminent arrival of divine judgment, was saturated with the language and imagery of Jewish apocalyptic tradition. The German scholar Albert Schweitzer, in his landmark 1906 work The Quest of the Historical Jesus, argued that Jesus must be understood as an apocalyptic prophet who genuinely believed the end of the present age was imminent. While subsequent scholarship has modified and debated this picture, the fundamental insight, that Jesus operated within a distinctly Jewish apocalyptic framework, remains highly influential. Whatever the precise chronology of Jesus' ministry, there is one event that virtually all historians regard as the decisive trigger for his arrest and execution: his disruption of commerce in the temple courts. All four canonical Gospels record what is commonly called the cleansing of the temple, or, in more neutral historical language, the temple incident. The accounts place it during the week before the crucifixion. In the Synoptic Gospels, this is the first week of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. In the Gospel of John, curiously, it is placed at the very beginning of his ministry, which most historians consider a theological reordering rather than a historical sequence. What happened in the temple courts? Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of the dove sellers. He drove people out. He prevented the carrying of goods through the temple courts. He cited the Hebrew prophets. Is it not written, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations"? But you have made it a den of robbers. Mark 11 verse 17, citing Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah 7 verse 11. Historians have debated the meaning and scale of this event. Was it a large-scale riot or a smaller symbolic demonstration? The temple courts, specifically the court of the Gentiles, were enormous. A full-scale disruption of the entire money-changing operation would have required significant force and would almost certainly have provoked immediate Roman military intervention from the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the Temple Mount and maintained a constant watch over the pilgrimage crowds. More likely, historians suggest, this was a dramatic prophetic gesture, one aimed less at the actual disruption of commerce and more at communicating a pointed message about the corruption and coming judgment of the temple establishment. This interpretation is supported by the prophetic language Jesus uses, the citation of Jeremiah's temple sermon, in which the prophet warned that God would destroy the temple if its leaders did not repent. The message, whatever its precise scope, landed. And it landed in the most dangerous possible place. The temple authorities had been watching Jesus for some time. His popularity with the pilgrimage crowds was itself a destabilizing factor during the most volatile week of the Jewish calendar. Now he had made a direct symbolic attack on the temple institution, the source of their authority and their wealth, and the foundation of their relationship with Rome. The chief priests and scribes, Mark's Gospel notes, heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people was astonished at his doctrine. Mark 11 verse 18. The clock had started. Pontius Pilate served as prefect of Judea from approximately 26 to 36 AD, a tenure of 10 years, which was actually quite long for the position, suggesting a competence at basic administration even if his political instincts were sometimes poor. We know more about Pilate than we do about most Roman prefects of his era, because his tenure in Judea generated multiple independent references in ancient sources. In addition to the Gospel accounts, Pilate is mentioned by Josephus in two separate incidents in the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War, and by the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, writing around 41 AD, who describes Pilate in characteristically diplomatic language as a man given to briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, wanton injuries, executions without trial, and countless and intolerable cruelties. The archaeological record has added physical substance to these textual references. In 1961, Italian archaeologists excavating the ancient theater at Caesarea Maritima discovered a stone inscription, now called the Pilate stone or Pilate inscription, that reads, in Latin, Tiberium / Pon, Tius Pilatus / Pref, Ectus Iuda, EAE, / FEC, it D.E.D. Icavit, meaning Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, made and dedicated this building. This inscription, now housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, provides independent archaeological confirmation of Pilate's title and tenure. Josephus records two incidents that illuminate Pilate's political character. In the first, Pilate brought military standards bearing the image of the emperor into Jerusalem during the night, a deliberate provocation, since Jewish law prohibited graven images in the holy city. When Jews gathered in Caesarea to protest, Pilate had them surrounded by soldiers and threatened with death. When they bared their necks, declaring they would rather die than see their laws transgressed, Pilate backed down, revealing both his willingness to use intimidation and his pragmatic restraint when confronted with mass passive resistance. In the second incident, Pilate used funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct for Jerusalem, a practically useful but legally and religiously problematic appropriation. The resulting protest was broken up by soldiers in civilian dress who beat protesters with clubs, causing deaths. The picture that emerges is of a Roman administrator who was neither a villain of melodramatic proportions nor a particularly enlightened governor, but rather a man of ordinary imperial ruthlessness, politically calculating, and genuinely concerned about maintaining order during the dangerously volatile Passover festival. His interest in the Jesus case, as we will see, was driven entirely by political calculation. He had no personal quarrel with Jesus of Nazareth. But he could not ignore a case brought to him by the temple authorities, the very collaborators upon whom his administration depended. Joseph Caiaphas served as high priest of the Jerusalem temple from approximately 18 to 36 AD, an exceptionally long tenure for the position, which suggests considerable political skill. He was the son-in-law of Annas, who had served as high priest before him and retained enormous informal influence, to the degree that Luke's Gospel identifies both men as joint holders of the high priesthood at the time of John the Baptist's appearance. The high priest was, in the Roman administrative framework, the single most important Jewish official in Judea. He presided over the Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council with judicial, religious, and administrative authority, and he served as Rome's primary interlocutor with the Jewish population. The Romans appointed and could remove high priests, giving them an additional lever of control. The fact that Caiaphas held the position for 18 years, through the prefectures of multiple Roman governors, indicates that he was exceptionally adept at navigating the impossible position of collaborating with Rome while maintaining enough credibility with the Jewish population to function. In 1990, construction workers in Jerusalem's Peace Forest accidentally uncovered a burial cave containing 12 ossuaries, or bone boxes. The most elaborately decorated bore the Aramaic inscription, Yosef bar Caiapha, Joseph son of Caiaphas, and contained the bones of a man approximately 60 years old. Most scholars believe this to be the ossuary and remains of the high priest himself, providing one of the most direct archaeological connections to the Passion narrative. Caiaphas's motivation in the Jesus case was, at its core, political survival and institutional protection. The Gospel of John preserves what appears to be a record of his essential reasoning. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. John 11 verses 49 to 50, attributed to Caiaphas. Whether or not these were his exact words, the sentiment is historically coherent. Caiaphas was calculating the risk calculus with brutal clarity. Jesus, commanding large popular followings during the most volatile week of the year, was a destabilizing force. If Roman troops were provoked into a crackdown, as they had been before, and would be again, the consequences for the Jewish people could be catastrophic. Better to eliminate one man than to risk Roman military action against the entire population. This was not cynical malice alone. It was the terrible logic of the collaborator, the man who has made a deal with overwhelming force, and must manage the contradictions of that deal every single day. Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great, governed the Galilee and Perea as tetrarch, a client ruler under Roman supervision. He was the man responsible for the execution of John the Baptist, which Josephus records in some detail. Luke's Gospel records that Pilate sent Jesus to Antipas for examination during the trial, since Jesus was a Galilean and therefore technically under Antipas's jurisdiction. Antipas apparently found the encounter unsatisfying. He had hoped to see Jesus perform a miracle, and return Jesus to Pilate without passing judgment. Antipas's involvement was a footnote. His real significance is as a member of the broader system of layered authority within which Jesus' execution occurred. The crucifixion was not a simple act of Roman repression. It was the product of an intricate web of overlapping jurisdictions, competing interests, and political calculations, a system designed, consciously or not, to distribute responsibility widely enough that no single actor need feel solely accountable for the outcome. The figure of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who reportedly betrayed Jesus to the temple authorities for 30 pieces of silver, has been one of the most debated in both historical and theological scholarship. The name Iscariot is itself debated. The most common explanation is that it derives from Ishkarioth, man from Kerioth, a town in southern Judea. This would make Judas the only non-Galilean among the 12 disciples, a geographic fact that some historians consider potentially significant. Judeans and Galileans had complex, sometimes tense relations in this period. What is the historical minimum? All four canonical Gospels, written at different times and places, agree that a member of Jesus' inner circle delivered information about his whereabouts to the temple authorities. The betrayal, a loaded word, may have consisted of nothing more sinister than identifying Jesus' nightly location in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, so that the temple authorities could arrest him away from the pilgrimage crowds, where a public arrest would risk provoking a riot. The 30 pieces of silver, cited in Matthew's account and connected by the evangelist to the prophecy of Zechariah, has generated extensive commentary. If historical, the sum was modest, enough to purchase a field, according to Matthew's account of what happened to the money afterward. Whether this is a literal historical detail or a symbolic connection to Hebrew prophecy is a matter of scholarly debate. Judas's motivation has been debated since antiquity. The Gospels themselves offer varying and not entirely consistent accounts, ranging from simple greed to satanic influence. Modern historians have proposed additional possibilities: ideological disillusionment if Jesus proved not to be the militant Messiah Judas had hoped for, a deliberate act intended to force a confrontation that Judas expected Jesus to survive through divine intervention, or a more mundane informer's transaction. The historical record does not permit certainty. The 12 disciples, the inner circle of Jesus' movement, largely disappear from the narrative at the moment of crisis. Mark's Gospel, generally considered the earliest, states bluntly that they all forsook him and fled at the time of the arrest. Peter's triple denial of knowing Jesus, narrated in all four Gospels, is one of the most psychologically vivid details in the Passion narrative, and, notably, one of the details that seems unlikely to have been invented by the early Christian community, precisely because it reflects so poorly on the Church's founding figure. The absence of the disciples during the trial and crucifixion is historically significant. It tells us something real about the terror of the situation, that being associated with a man condemned by both the temple authorities and Rome was genuinely life-threatening. Several women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joses, and Salome in Mark's account, are said to have remained near the site of the crucifixion. Their presence and loyalty, documented across all gospel traditions, is another detail that scholars tend to regard as historically reliable, again in part because the elevation of women as principal witnesses was not socially convenient for the early church. The trial of Jesus, or more accurately, the sequence of interrogations, hearings, and judgments through which he passed between his arrest in the garden and his death on the cross, is one of the most analyzed judicial proceedings in all of ancient history. It has been examined by legal historians, New Testament scholars, Roman legal experts, and Jewish legal scholars, and it remains contested in almost every significant detail. What can we say with confidence? After the Passover meal, which the Synoptic Gospels identify with the Seder, the ritual meal beginning the Passover festival, though the Gospel of John places it a day earlier, before Passover began, Jesus and his disciples went to an olive grove on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, known as Gethsemane. The name derives from the Aramaic for oil press. An armed group arrived, described in the Gospels as including temple guards and Roman soldiers, accompanied by Judas, who identified Jesus for the arresting party. The arrest was made, the disciples fled, and Jesus was taken. The involvement of Roman soldiers in the arrest is debated. Roman military personnel would not normally involve themselves in internal Jewish religious disputes. However, the chief priests had direct access to the Roman prefect, and it is plausible that during the high-security environment of the Passover festival, Pilate had agreed to provide security